Welcome to the Book Party Podcast. Join us as we journey into the world of books with Michael T. Prepare to be captivated by engaging interviews, insightful discussions, and fascinating stories. You'll discover new adventures and gain insight into the creative process of the authors themselves as they share their struggles and accomplishments. Now let's hear from Michael T.
This is Michael T., and welcome to the Book Party Podcast, where we dive deep into the fascinating world of literature and history. Today we have an exceptional guest, author Dr. Vivian Sieber, who has penned the incredible book Kino and Kinder, A Family Journey in the Shadow of the Holocaust. Dr. Vivian Sieber is an accomplished author and has rich background in biosciences research, education, development, learning technology, and information literacy. She hails from the historic city of Oxford, where she resides with her husband and dogs, and in her retirement, she's taken up the art of pottery, proving that creativity knows no bounds. Now let's turn our attention to her latest work, Kino and Kinder. This powerful book sheds light on a harrowing story of a European Jewish family's resilience in the face of the darkest chapter in human history, the Holocaust. Through the lens of Dr. Sieber's meticulous research and the voices of survivors, this book paints a vivid picture of their struggle. And what makes it even more poignant is the inclusion of over 80 historical photographs that bring life into the haunting narrative. In 1915, the Ticho family purchased a cinema in Vienna, known as the Palast Kino, managed by two single Jewish women, Paula and Selma. It thrived until the 1930s, when the specter of Nazi antisemitism cast its shadow. Paula, fearing for her family's safety, made the heartbreaking decision to send her son to England before fleeing herself, leaving behind a forcibly taken cinema and becoming a penniless refugee. Paula's journey brought her to a role as a matron in hostels in Tinnemouth and Windermere, where she cared for 25 Jewish girls evacuated from Europe. Through the Kinder transport, Dr. Sieber weaves a heart-rending tale by using the girls' own accounts of their experiences, from their early encounters with antisemitism to the trauma of surviving when so many of their family members perished. Kino and Kinder is a profound retelling that encompasses the insidious rise of antisemitism, life in Vienna, Central Europe before World War II, and the challenges of post-war London. Dr. Sieber's memoir, History of Her Families, paints the most vivid and powerful picture of those dark, deadly years. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Vivian Sieber to the show and delve into the remarkable story behind Kino and Kinder. Dr. Sieber, thank you for joining us today. And why don't you take it from here, fill in the blanks a bit, and tell our listeners about yourself.
Well, you've said most of it. I trained as a biologist, in fact, in plant genetics, and then did bioscience research for 10 or 15 years, moved sideways into a senior lectureship in genetics, and then moved into learning technology and persuading other people to use technology in their teaching. So over the time, I've worked in quite a few UK institutions in Manchester, London, and Oxford and Surrey. And I spent a very busy career doing things, and then found about 10 years ago that I didn't have a day job, which gave me time to start thinking about all the materials I'd gained from my family. So when my dad died in 2000, he left an attaché case which was full of correspondence between him and his mother, my grandmother, and lots of other people. And the letters were rather random. They went all dated. they were, fortunately, Peter typed his letters, but they were all in English. He also left manuscripts which he'd written in the 70s that hadn't been published, contemporary journals from his time during the war, sort of 1941 onwards. And most importantly, he'd left the contact details and a file he'd created of the girls that my grandmother had cared for in the hostels in Tynemouth and Windermere. Just before he died, he did a survey of the girls, now old ladies, as asking them what they'd done with their lives, what qualifications they'd got, what family they had, where they lived. And many of them wrote very movingly of their time in the hostel. So I had that material. I also had their contact details. And sadly, there aren't as many now as there were back in 2000. And then my husband and I went to Vienna on a holiday, and I'd very cheekily emailed all the occupants of the flats. I'd always known the address of grandmother's flat, which is extremely posh. And anyway, I emailed all of them. We had one invitation to coffee and homemade strudel, and that turned out to be my grandmother's flat. And the people we'd imposed on were a bit intrigued by the story, and had been to the archives and had already got quite a lot of information about the cinema, my grandmother, other family. And they really kindly set us on the quest. They told us which archives to go to and how to get there, how to visit my grandfather's grave and his siblings' graves. And that rather started me off. The Austrian archives the Vienna archives have been amazing. They sent great parcels of papers, and there was a very rich source of data, of information there. And then, of course, we had lockdown. And so I spent the time folding this information together, and it turned into the book. I'd also, just before lockdown, contacted some of the old ladies who were the Kinder, and they were very generous and invited us to visit, let us record our conversation, and told us amazing things about what it was like to be a refugee in 1939, what it was like to leave your family as young children. And some were very young. Inga, who I speak to regularly, is now 90. She was 5.5 when she came to England. And that is very young indeed. Of course, they had no language. They'd gone from happy families to an institution, a hostel. So that also informed what I wrote.
Well, on your publishing journey, did you go the self-publishing route? Did you find an agent and go the agency route? Or did you do something in between, like a hybrid route? How did you do your publishing?
I was very lucky. My first efforts at writing, a friend read. And I trained as a scientist. Scientists tend to write very briefly. So I rather wrote, this happened, that happened, that happened. And my friend said, no, you need to amplify. And he corrected the English so that we could get it to a position I could show it to a publisher, because I did want a review process. I've come from an academic background. I'm used to scientific papers where they get refereed. My first attempt was a bit of a disaster, and it was an academic publisher who said yes and then changed their mind. And my second was a hybrid. It's Eye-to-Eye Publishing in Manchester. And they provided a very sympathetic editor. I mean, it had been rewritten completely following my friend's comments several times. So then Eye-to-Eye gave me Mark Cripps, who was a lovely editor, who wanted to help me write my book. But he reacted by saying, no, you can't have 122 footnotes, and divided up the chapters. I had one chapter that was 80 pages long, and he said, no, you can't have that. and helped me chop it up to make it much more digestible. Eye to Eye did the cover, and I think that they did there wasn't any typesetting because it went from Word. Mark and I slightly shared the editing because the typesetting or the typing, because I'm quite a very experienced Word user, and so had used index and styles and things automatically. That I did that side of it.
Okay.
They gave me a style sheet to apply.
Well, take us to a point in time that you would consider in writing this book to consider your worst author moment.
I suspect it was actually with two people with very different experience of using Word doing different things, and I managed to sort of trash a very late version of the manuscript. And fortunately, I have a very IT literate husband who sorted it out for me. But that was fairly disastrous when I got the whole thing. And it's, of course, a very big file. And because the pictures, I should have mentioned the pictures. My dad left this cardboard box of historic photographs. So my husband kindly scanned them. And that's where the photographs in the book mostly come from. Once you've got the photographs in as well, and you're using someone else's style sheet, it just was rather, it was a rather disastrous crash my computer, and we were then not clear what version we'd got.
Well, let's flip the coin a little bit about what I call an epiphany moment. It's usually a moment where you're not actually writing, you're doing something else. And all of a sudden, a bright light bulb goes off in your head. Something happens to where, oh, wow moment, or something that you just got to write this down right now. This has to go in the book, because if you don't write it down right now, it's going to fade away and it's just not going to be as good. Do you have a moment like that when you're writing the book?
Well, I started with this rather strange. It follows a timeline, so that was straightforward because I started with my great-grandparents, working slightly backwards and then forward. So I had a chronology. And I just started writing sections and filling them in. Now, I went forwards and backwards quite a lot on that. I think there was a moment when I was doing research, and it is remarkable how much you can get from databases. And I was looking up my great aunt who died in Theresienstadt. And all of a sudden, quite late one evening, her death certificate popped up on the screen. And I think I'd known already that I wanted to tell the story. But that made it very clear that I did have to tell the story. Very, very early on, because I was a geneticist, I did a family tree. And because I knew very little about my father's side of the family. Actually, I didn't know that much about my grandmother's side of the family, really. And so building the family tree was an early thing to do. And I sort of realized I was doing it. It started as an intellectual puzzle, what happened? What happened to these people? Who were they? In fact, how many great aunts did I have? But after a while, they became people. Certainly when Selma's death certificate flipped up, that was no longer just an intellectual puzzle. That was, that is a relative of mine who's been murdered. And of course, that enforced I want to write this.
We'll switch this to today. What is the one thing that you're the most fired up about or the most excited about right now, today?
The fragility of freedom, and that we must learn from the Holocaust, and this sort of destruction of the danger of extreme politics, whether left or right, which we're seeing in Britain and in America and in other countries as well, and possibly the danger of social media and how an idea can get stretched beyond reason. So that's what I'm particularly fired up about.
Okay, well, this is Michael T. We invite you to go to bookpartypodcast.com, hit that subscribe tab on top, then scroll down to the icon of your choice, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or Odyssey. You can find and download us there, and please leave a review. Don't forget to sign up for our video newsletter and get the latest information on our upcoming shows. Now, Vivian, we're entering the lightning round, and in the lightning round, we have 4 questions. They're 4 pointed questions for 4 pointed answers. So, what was holding you back when you first started writing as an author? What was holding you back from becoming an author in the first place?
Time. I had quite full-time jobs and domestic life. Commuting, and also because the subject matter, I don't think I could have begun to address it until I had the time and until I was that much older. I think it would have been very difficult to think of. I'm not the only person who reaches retirement and then starts writing, looking into their family background and writing about the Holocaust.
That's true. What was the best advice once you started writing? What's the best advice you had ever received?
Oh, the advice from my first editor, which was to describe everything, put in the background, not assume that everybody else knew what I knew, and so to take it from like a wireframe or a sketch, and bring in the color and the characters and the detail. So to tell it into a story rather than a report.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Share one of your personal habits that contributes to your success.
Well, I'm very, very lucky that I've worked in universities and worked a lot with librarians. So I've learned an enormous amount about finding information, searching for it, evaluating it and finding it. So I find that quite easy. Because I'm come from science, I ask questions. I've always asked questions. It's quite irritating for everybody else sometimes. But of course, that doesn't mean I enjoy doing research and sort of finding out the background, in this case, for the book.
Okay. Can you share an internet resource with our listeners that you use when you write?
Well, I used quite a few very specific Holocaust databases, and I used Genie to construct the family tree in the first instance. I have, since publishing it, started using Ancestry and MyHeritage. I didn't when I was doing the original research, and that might have made my life a lot easier. I use Google an awful lot. Using a search engine. That's probably my biggest tool.
Okay. Well, Vivian, we're now going to enter the grand finale. In the grand finale, what I'd like you to do is take your time and just tell our listeners about your book.
Kino and Kinder is the story of my family. It begins in Brno, in Czechoslovakia, with my great-grandparents who were drapers. They ended up having 3 shops in the Kraut Market, the main square in Brno. And my grandmother was the youngest of 5. She was very small, very pretty, very determined. And she married very young. It was a disaster. But she married the first man who'd take her to Vienna, essentially. Had a child, discovered he was unfaithful, snatched the baby and got on the train back to her parents. And she then spent a few years bored in Brno. I don't think she enjoyed having a toddler at her ankles. But somehow or other, she persuaded her parents that what they really needed to do as drapers in Brno was buy a cinema in Vienna. And in 1915, the family bought the Palast Kino, which is in Josefstadterstrasse. And Paula and her sister moved to Vienna to run it. Paula, it was a great success. Paula was very flamboyant. She did things with the cinema industry. I've got these amazing photographs of her in evening dress. She opened Vienna balls. And eventually along comes my grandfather. They married. My dad comes along. And I've got this lovely picture of him as a tiny baby in a very, very fluffy nursing home, lots of flowers. Tragically, my grandfather was killed in a road traffic accident when my dad was only 5. And my grandmother, Paula, went back to running the cinema and looking after her 2 boys. Now, they lived in a really posh flat. It overlooks the Josefstadterstrasse. It overlooks the Ringstrasse. You can see the university from the windows. And, of course, conditions in Vienna and Austria everywhere deteriorated for Jews over the 1930s until in 1938 you've got the Anschluss. Hitler and the Germans simply march across the border and through into Vienna, and there's a triumphal march on the Ringstrasse as they move to the Heldenplatz. My grandmother and father, hidden behind the huge windows in the flat, watched that and were terrified. And my grandmother realised she had to send her son to safety in England, which she did. She sent him to his half-brother, who was already in London. And then, with great difficulty, because she had to raise the funds, and the only money she actually had was in the cinema. And the cinema had been confiscated by the Nazis very quickly. Her sister had just been widowed. Selma couldn't move. She was in pieces. And, of course, she needed to leave an income for Selma. So she sold what she could, but every other Jew in Vienna was selling what they could. So there wasn't really a market. And eventually she appealed to a former lover for money. And that must have been very, very difficult for such an independent woman. She arrived in England penniless because you were only allowed to take about £5, and got a job as the matron of as one of the matrons of a hostel in Newcastle, first of all in Newcastle, in Tynemouth. And this is where she cared for 25. Well, we don't actually know how many girls. I suspect that over the years it was probably about 40, but there are about 25 that we know about. My dad moved to Newcastle and actually went and lived with one of the families that were on the committee that ran the hostel. And in many ways, that's why he wanted to acknowledge them. The hostel, the girls wrote about their experience in the hostel, about the terror of crossing Europe as very young children on trains with unknown adults. Several mentioned the kindness of the Dutch. As they get to Holland, they're given nice food. They then get the sea crossing to Harwich. Some of them end up in Liverpool Street, not knowing whether they're at, Liverpool Street. If you don't know anything, they thought they were in Liverpool. Others get put on trains being told to go to Newcastle, not knowing where Newcastle is. And they wrote very movingly about this experience. They also wrote about adjusting to life in the hostel, how kind the teachers were, and how amazing it was for the schools to adjust when they suddenly got 25 children who didn't speak English. The second half of the book, I'm trying to answer the question of what happened to the cinema, both over the war and after the war. And this is where I have to acknowledge enormous help from Helen and Heinz Rupertsberger, who visited the archives and sent me, Helen photographed about 120 papers, which she popped into Dropbox for me. And we've worked out that cinema was returned to the family quite quickly, but it was derelict. It had been working all through the war, and no investment. The Nazis had taken the money. Then it was used, and the American service personnel had free performances. So it was only making one paid performance a day. It was desperately at a loss. My dad went to Vienna because he was by then in the Royal Navy. He was in the naval intelligence, and discovered that most of the family had died, were murdered. Paula didn't get the cinema. She got the cinema back, but then there was a counterclaim from a nephew who had escaped to Palestine. And she never felt she got the money she really deserved for the cinema. She needed that money to live because she was by then in her 60s and too old to work, really. I've also say what happened to the girls and how they developed lives of their own, had families. Most went into caring professions. A few got degrees and went into teaching. Others worked in nursing or in catering and school catering and things like that. And it ends with I met the only survivor, really, my grandmother's niece, Fritzi, in Brno in the late 90s. And that was incredibly memorable. And finally, the Austrians offered nationality to victims of National Socialism, which I took. And so it sort of ends with that in some ways. So it spans about 1880 to certainly 1980, perhaps nearer 2020.
Okay. Well, Dr. Sieber, we thank you so much for being here with us today and opening up to us, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate this too. Again, this is Michael T. To all our listeners, I would invite you to go to bookpartypodcast.com and hit that subscribe tab on top. Scroll down to the icon of your choice where you can find us on one of your favorite platforms, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or Odyssey. You can download and follow us there. Please leave a review. And don't forget to sign up for our video newsletter and get the latest information on our upcoming shows. Book Party Podcast is owned and powered by MTM Legacy Publishing, LLC. This is Michael T. and signing off.
You must not miss our next episode as we delve into a world of inspiration, entertainment, and thought-provoking insights. Join Michael T. on the next Book Party Podcast and experience a new adventure, a new story, and a complete immersion into the world of Pages Unveiled, Chronicles of the Writing Journey.